miniature nose and mouth, and closed eyes, streamlined as if by time, by the eons that had preceded this child down the biological kingdom. Waking into the deep dream of life, it seemed not young, but infinitely old, millions of years entrained in the pharaoh-like smoothness of its cheeks, and its ancient eyelids and nostrils. Its lips were composed, as if it had patiently endured the immense journey across the universe to this modest house with its waiting mother.
It's permissible, I think, to harbour a little scepticism about exactly how self-consciously Ballard sought the solidity of family life as a necessary anchor for his fictional wanderings at that time. But there's no disputing the brilliance with which he wrote about the essential human experiences in later years, as that excerpt from The Kindness of Women demonstrates. What Ballard couldn't possibly have anticipated was how brutally the newly fitted carpet was to be yanked from beneath his feet, and those of his children.
It was when your children were, I think, aged 7, 5 and 4, and you were 34, that your wife died very suddenly. What happened exactly?
We were on holiday in Spain, and she caught a rare form of pneumonia and died, within 24 hours. It was a completely unexpected tragedy that absolutely bowled me for 6.
While Ballard's early science fiction writing was by no means stereotypic, there was a sense in which it had yet to be fully achieved. Significantly, he always omitted his first novel, The Wind from Nowhere, published in 1962, from his list of works. But the death of his wife acted as a ghastly catalyst.
I mean, I felt at the time that nature had committed a terrible crime against my wife and my children. I mean, I think the death of my wife provided me with a sort of renewed impetus to make sense of the sort of arbitrary cruelty of the world.
This sense of nature as malevolent, a biota like an Old Testament Jehovah, resonated throughout Ballard's stories and novels in the 1960s, such as The Drowned World and The Drought, culminating in one of his acknowledged masterpieces, The Atrocity Exhibition.
Entering the exhibition, Travis sees the atrocities of Vietnam and the Congo mimetized in the alternate death of Elizabeth Taylor. He tends the dying film star, eroticizing her punctured bronchus in the over-ventilated verandas of the London Hilton. He dreams of Max Ernst, superior of the birds, Europe after the rain, the human race. Caliban, asleep across a mirror smeared with vomit.
The Atrocity Exhibition, with its elegant restatement of the modernist aesthetic for a postmodern and post-Lapsarian world, gained Ballard a more literary reputation. He seemed to have grasped an essential truth about the cultural revolutions of the 1960s that was utterly denied to anyone with flowers in their hair. If there was anything wreathed in Ballard's hair, it was barbed wire.
A lot of the sort of machine-like alienated sex that takes place in books like Crash or High Rise is a reflection of my own sort of despair after the death of my wife and the sort of peculiar affectless quality that life in the late 60s began to have, when I think it all began to come apart at the seams. Sensation ruled the late 60s. Nothing mattered unless it was like firing an electric current into the leg of a dead frog. All you were looking for was a sort of larger and larger kick. And this kick could be provided by drugs or films of car crashes or pure sensation transmitted through television. I mean, the people worried about the sort of violence that's shown on television now obviously have forgotten the sort of commonplace scenes of dreadful violence that were shown on British television during, say, the Civil War in the Congo and the Vietnam War. And all this had a sort of deadening of the emotions. And it seemed to me that one needed to perhaps embrace this world to see what would happen, immerse oneself in the most destructive element, in Conrad's words, and see if one could swim in this new realm.
Ballard's own coinage to describe the zeitgeist of this craven new world was the death of affect. And in the early 1970s, his writing sought out zones of pure sensation as remorselessly as a toothache sufferer's tongue probes painful cavities. The writer had by now extended the parameters of his methodology, at first through fake adverts which he produced for the magazine Ambit, and then, in 1970, he staged an exhibition of crashed cars at the New Art Laboratory in London that almost resulted in a riot. In his novel, Crash, Ballard's alter ego, James Ballard, cruises the flyovers and motorways of the London periphery, becoming an initiate of a bizarre cult dedicated to exploring the sexual potential of car accidents. Ballard said his aim in writing the novel was not to arouse, but to rub the reader's face in his own vomit. The first publisher's report on Crash suggested that the writer was mentally ill, and certainly at the time Ballard wrote the book, he was skating the margin between despair and revelation.
She turned her face towards me, making no effort now to hide the scar line on her face. I was well aware of the strong undertow of hostility moving towards me. The traffic stream reached the Stanwell intersection. I followed the queue of cars, already thinking of how she would behave during sexual intercourse. I tried to visualize her broad mouth around her husband's penis, sharp fingers between his buttocks searching out his prostate. She touched the yellow hull of a fuel tanker beside us, its massive rear wheels only 6 inches from her elbow. As she read the fire instructions on the tank, I stared at her firm calves and thighs. Had she any notion of the man or woman with whom her next sex act would take place? I felt my penis stirring as the lights changed. I moved from the fast into the slow lane, taking up my position in front of the fuel tanker. The arch of the flyover rose against the skyline, its northern ramp shielded by the white rectangle of a plastics factory. The untouched rectilinear volumes of this building fused in my mind with the contours of her calves and thighs pressed against the vinyl seating. Clearly unaware that we were moving towards our original meeting ground, Helen Remington crossed and uncrossed her legs, shifting these white volumes as the front elevations of the plastics factory moved past.
But as this reading shows, Ballard's obsession with Autogeddon wasn't just sexual. He understood the way that the built environment was itself becoming an actor in the tragedy of social disintegration. And in 1975's High Rise, he imagined a war breaking out between the inhabitants of a residential building, a skyscraper that Ballard had, prophetically, sighted on the Isle of Dogs, precisely where the gleaming towers of Canary Wharf would lance upwards a decade later.
Wilder helped himself to the last of the small cat that had been barbecued above the fire. His teeth pulled at the stringy meat, the still warm fat almost intoxicating him as he sucked at the skewer. The young woman leaned affably against him, content to have Wilder's strong arm around her shoulders. The fresh smell of her body surprised him. The higher up the apartment building he moved, the cleaner were the women. Wilder looked down at her unmarked face, as open and amiable as a domestic animal's. She seemed to have been totally untouched by events within the high-rise, as if waiting in some kind of insulated chamber for Wilder to appear. He tried to speak to her, but found himself grunting, unable to form the words with his broken teeth and scarred tongue. Pleasantly high on the meat, he lay back against the young woman, playing with the silver handbag pistol. Without thinking, he opened the front of her suede jacket and loosened her breasts. He placed his hands over the small nipples and settled himself against her. He felt drowsy, murmuring to the young woman while she